without a trace. Days later, he looked closer at one of their wedding photos, and what he saw in the background changed everything. Watch till the end, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to see it. The air smelled of pine and morning mist as the black SUV wound its way up the secluded mountain road, flanked on either side by dense forest and jagged cliffs. The early sun filtered through the towering redwoods, casting long golden beams across the winding asphalt. In the back seat, Kyla leaned her head against the window, eyes half closed, absorbing the serenity. Her hand rested comfortably in her husband's, their fingers interlaced in quiet contentment. Beside her, Jonathan Miller sat upright, his crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his face a mix of exhaustion and wonder. The honeymoon had only just begun, but for Jonathan, it already felt like a reprieve from the whirlwind of attention and judgment they had faced since their wedding. Marrying Kyla had not been the easy, polished affair his family had envisioned for him. She was a brilliant civil rights attorney, fiercely independent, unapologetically black, and wholly uninterested in appeasing anyone's expectations, least of all his mother's. Kyla had faced the snide comments at the rehearsal dinner with grace. The whispers about ambition and attitude at the reception had rolled off her back. But Jonathan had seen the way her jaw had tightened, how she'd clutched his hand a little harder when his mother, Margaret, offered her a veiled compliment about bringing color to the family. Now, as the SUV approached the towering gates of Silver Ridge Retreat, a high-end resort buried deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains, he hoped to leave all that behind. The metal gates opened soundlessly, revealing a sweeping drive that led to a lodge so elegant it seemed carved from the very forest around it. Cedar beams, glass panels, stone walls. It was the kind of place where silence was luxury and privacy was absolute. The concierge greeted them with polite efficiency, though Kyla caught the fleeting flicker in his eyes as he registered her presence. It wasn't overt, no grimace, no hesitation, but she had grown used to such micro-reactions. Jonathan didn't notice, or perhaps he pretended not to. Their suite was palatial. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the mountains. A private hot tub on the balcony steamed invitingly in the cool morning air. Kyla walked barefoot across the stone floor, twirling slowly, her white sundress catching the light like wings. "Now this," she said with a smile, "feels like a fresh start." They spent the rest of the day in unhurried bliss. Kyla unpacked her books and laid out her yoga mat near the balcony. Jonathan skimmed a medical journal but quickly abandoned it in favor of watching her stretch. That evening, they dined by candlelight in a private booth overlooking a mist-covered lake. Their laughter blended with the rustling wind and the distant calls of birds settling into the trees. Later that night, Kyla nestled against Jonathan's chest under the down comforter, the soft crackle of the fireplace soothing them into a drowsy silence. She traced circles on his skin with her fingers, murmuring about how this place felt like something out of a dream. In the morning, she rose before him. She had signed up for sunrise yoga, followed by a spa treatment, a deep tissue massage, and a facial. She kissed him gently on the forehead, whispering that she'd see him at breakfast around 9. When Jonathan woke at 8:30, the sun had already climbed high, illuminating the suite in golden hues. He stretched, showered, and ordered coffee. By 9:15, he was sitting alone on the veranda, a cup cooling in his hand, glancing at the path leading to the spa. He checked his watch again. 9:30. He wasn't worried. Kyla was always losing track of time when she was relaxed. but by 10, unease crept in. He called her phone, only to hear a faint buzz from the bedroom. He walked inside and found her cell resting on the nightstand, untouched. Jonathan's stomach tightened. Kyla never left her phone behind. It was her tether to the world, her tool, her defense. He went to the front desk, trying to keep his voice calm. The young woman at the counter assured him that Miss Miller had not checked in at the spa. She offered to have staff look around discreetly in case she'd gotten lost on the hiking trails or wandered to the reading lounge. But as the minutes turned to an hour, then 2, and staff returned with nothing, Jonathan's concern turned to dread. By noon, he was pacing the main lodge like a man possessed. He returned to the suite twice, hoping she would just appear, laughing, apologizing. He checked the spa again. No one had seen her since yoga. He spoke with the instructor, who said she had left the class alone, serene, smiling. No one had followed her. No one had noticed anything strange. At 2 in the afternoon, Jonathan drove down to the nearest police station, a 20-minute descent on narrow switchbacks, and filed a missing persons report. The officer on duty, a broad man with a sunburned face and mirrored sunglasses, took the report with the disinterest of someone who had seen too many overreactions. "How long's she been missing?" the officer asked, already reaching for a form. 6 hours. 6? The man raised a skeptical brow. "Sir, that's not exactly a crisis." Jonathan leaned over the desk. "She left for yoga at 6:45. Her phone's here. She missed a spa appointment. She missed breakfast and lunch. She's not answering. She never just disappears." Maybe she needed space. Sometimes women do that. The insinuation made Jonathan's blood boil. "She's not the kind of woman who would disappear without telling me. Something's wrong." The officer sighed and started typing. "We'll send a deputy up to look around. Maybe she's just cooling off. Honeymoons can be stressful." Jonathan clenched his jaw and nodded stiffly. He returned to the resort, his heart hammering. Evening fell, and the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting the valley into cold shadow. The luxury of the resort began to feel like a trap. Every creak of the timber walls, every passing shadow outside their suite window seemed to mock him. He checked her belongings. Nothing was missing. Her wallet still sat in her purse, her books untouched. By midnight, panic had calcified into numbness. Jonathan sat at the edge of the bed, the silence around him unbearable. The fireplace crackled gently behind him, but its warmth didn't reach his bones. He opened his tablet and began scrolling through the wedding photos that their planner, Lana, had sent the night before. Dozens of perfect shots. Their first kiss, the toast, dancing under string lights, Kyla's smile so wide it made his chest ache. Then he paused. One image, taken as they walked down the aisle, hand in hand, guests clapping behind them, caught his attention. Something in the background didn't fit. He zoomed in, heart beginning to race. Near the back row, behind a cluster of smiling guests, a man stood motionless. Unlike the others, he wasn't clapping. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't even looking at Jonathan. His eyes were locked on Kyla. The man wore a gray suit, unremarkable in every way but his posture. Rigid, tense, watching. His face, partially shadowed, bore a look that chilled Jonathan to the core. He knew that face. He hadn't seen him in person, but he had seen his photo. A name surfaced, dragging ice with it. Mark Delray. The man Kyla had spoken of once in hushed tones late at night. The ex-husband she never wanted to discuss. The man who had stalked her after the divorce until she signed an NDA in exchange for silence about his shady pharmaceutical dealings. She had said it was over, that she'd buried it. But here he was, at their wedding, watching her. Jonathan's blood roared in his ears. He reached for his phone, adrenaline flooding his veins. He had to call someone. He had to act. He had to find her before it was too late. The room felt darker now, though nothing had changed. The fire still flickered gently in the hearth. The suite was as silent and untouched as it had been an hour ago, but Jonathan sat frozen, staring at the image on his tablet, the face of Mark Delray etched into the background of his perfect day like a scar carved into marble. The world seemed to narrow around that face, expressionless, predatory, watching Kyla like she was prey, and he'd been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He didn't know how long he sat there, staring. His fingers trembled as he zoomed in further. The more he examined the photo, the clearer it became. The eyes, the jawline, even the slight tilt of the man's head. He was certain now. It was him. Delray had been at their wedding, and no one had seen him, not the security staff, not their wedding planner, not even Kyla. Or maybe she had, and never told him. Jonathan's thoughts swirled like a storm, building into a hurricane. He remembered how Kyla once spoke of Delray's obsession with control, with appearing untouchable. She had never gone into detail about the end of their marriage, only that it was suffocating and cruel. She had once whispered that she feared what he would do if she ever tried to expose him. But that fear had faded, replaced with hope and purpose. With him, with their life together. And yet, here he was, a ghost stepping into the present. With trembling hands, Jonathan closed the photo app and opened his contacts. His thumb hovered over the name. Lana Colding, their wedding coordinator. If anyone might have noticed something, it would be her. He called. Voicemail. He left a terse message, trying to sound calm. Lana, it's Jonathan. I need to know if you remember seeing a man in a gray suit near the back of the ceremony. Tall, light-skinned, around 40. I think he might have been an uninvited guest. Please, call me back as soon as you get this. He ended the call and paced the room. The silence pressed in. He needed answers, not guesses. He needed someone who could make sense of the photo, someone with tools and experience. A name surfaced. Malik Pearson, an old college friend and digital forensic specialist now working in Oakland. They hadn't spoken in over a year, but this wasn't the time to worry about formalities. Jonathan called. Malik picked up on the second ring. Yo, Jay, long time. I need your help, Jonathan cut in, his voice taut with urgency. It's Kyla. She's missing. I think she's been taken. There was a pause. Taken? What do you mean? Jonathan explained, quickly, breathlessly. The honeymoon, the yoga class, the missing phone, the absence from the spa, and now the photo. Malik listened, the sound of typing in the background indicating he was already pulling up something. Send me the picture, Malik said. High res if you have it. I'll analyze it. Check metadata, reflection angles, facial recognition, whatever I can pull. Hang tight. Jonathan sent the photo. Minutes passed like hours. While he waited, he reviewed every interaction at the resort from the past 48 hours. The valet who parked their car, the bellhop who brought their luggage, the spa receptionist, the yoga instructor. Had any of them seemed off? Had anyone avoided eye contact with Kyla? He recalled the front desk clerk's subtle tone when confirming the spa booking. Kyla had noticed it too. He remembered the brief flicker of discomfort in her eyes. Was that just casual rudeness or something deeper? His phone buzzed. Malik. I ran it through every damn database I have access to. That guy in the photo? You're right. It's Mark Delray. I matched him against his old business headshots and a DUI mugshot from 5 years ago. It's him. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He had hoped he was wrong. "There's more," Malik continued. "I checked the metadata. That photo was taken at exactly 4:23 p.m. on your wedding day. It's geotagged correctly. But here's the thing. He's not in any other photos. Not before, not after. It's like he just materialized." Jonathan felt a chill crawl down his spine. "I also looked up Del Rey's public profile. Nothing recent. But get this. 2 months ago, he dissolved his company and transferred assets to a shell corporation. The name of the managing partner on that corporation?" A pause. "Margaret A. Miller." Jonathan nearly dropped the phone. "His mother?" "No, that can't be," he whispered, but deep down, something already knew it was true. "I'm sorry, man," Malik said. "You should consider the possibility that this was coordinated, someone with money and access. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was logistics." The phone slipped from Jonathan's hand and landed on the bed. He stood in place, the floor suddenly unsteady beneath him. His mother, the woman who had raised him, guided him through medical school, hosted his engagement party. Could she really be behind this? He remembered their last conversation before the wedding. She had said, "Some things are worth fighting for, even if the other person doesn't see it yet." At the time, he thought she meant reconciling with his estranged uncle. Now, the words twisted into something far more sinister. The following morning, Jonathan packed his things and checked out of the resort. The staff looked puzzled, but didn't ask questions. He drove down the mountain with a single purpose. He had to talk to his mother. He arrived at the Miller estate that evening, the house looming like a museum of old wealth. Marble pillars, manicured gardens, silence wrapped in privilege. Margaret welcomed him with her usual poise, her blonde hair pinned back, pearls at her neck. "Jonathan," she said warmly, "I thought you'd be away for another week." "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She led him into the sitting room. A fire glowed in the hearth. She poured herself tea but didn't offer him any. "I know what you did," he said quietly. "You were involved with Del Rey. You knew he was at our wedding." Margaret set her cup down, her expression unreadable. "I had hoped you wouldn't dig," she said finally. "But I see I underestimated your resolve." His heart pounded. "Where is she?" "I don't know," she said, and for a moment he believed her. "I wanted you to have a clean life, a future untainted by controversy. Kyla, she's brilliant, yes, but dangerous. She makes enemies in high places. She would have brought trouble." "She's my wife," Jonathan said, fists clenched. Margaret looked almost mournful. "You could have had anyone, but you chose someone who would destroy you." He stood. "If you had anything to do with this, I'll expose you. I don't care who you are." From there, he would have 10 minutes, maybe 15, to locate Kyla's room before the next security check. It was risky. It was insane. But it was the only way. That night, as Jonathan lay on the motel bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, he replayed every moment he had ever spent with Kyla. Their first meeting at the hospital fundraiser, where she had cornered a board member over his department's racially skewed dismissal rates. Their first real argument over whether he could truly understand her lived experience. Their reconciliation, quiet and sincere, when she took his hand and said, "I don't need you to understand everything. I just need you to listen." She had always been the brave one, the righteous one, the one who fought back. Now it was his turn. At dawn, he followed Antonio's instructions and approached the east side of Northwood. The trees were dense here, and the ground sloped sharply downward. He moved in silence, heart pounding with every step. At precisely 6:45, the service door clicked open. Antonio stepped out, pushing a cart stacked with towels and folded gowns. Jonathan slipped through the door, his breath shallow. The corridor smelled of antiseptic and lavender. The walls were sterile, beige, unwelcoming. Antonio led him past 2 locked supply rooms and into a narrow hallway lined with identical doors. At the far end was room 214. "She's in there," Antonio whispered. "They sedate her during the day. She might be groggy." Jonathan nodded and turned the knob. The room was small, white, clinical. A hospital bed sat near the window, its blinds closed. Machines hummed softly, and in the bed, beneath a thin blanket, lay Kyla. His knees nearly buckled. She was thinner than he remembered, her cheekbones sharper, her skin pale. Her hair was loose around her face, lightly damp. An IV snaked into her arm. She stirred as he stepped closer. "Kyla," he breathed. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, confusion clouded them. Then recognition, then tears. He rushed to her side, cradling her hand. "They said you wouldn't come," she whispered. "I'm here," he said. "I'm getting you out." But time was running short. Antonio stood at the door, keeping watch. 5 minutes. Jonathan gently pulled the IV free, wrapped Kyla in a robe, and lifted her into his arms. She was weak but conscious. They moved quickly, retracing their steps down the hallway and into the service corridor. They made it back to the exit. Just before they reached the tree line, an alarm blared behind them. Someone had discovered the empty bed. Antonio shoved open the back gate. "Go!" Jonathan ran. Kyla held tightly against him, his legs burning as he climbed the ravine. Shouts erupted behind them. Flashlights slashed through the trees, but they didn't stop. They reached the car hidden beneath a camouflaged tarp and sped away, mud flying from the tires. Only after they reached the safety of the highway, hours later, did Jonathan finally pull over and exhale. Kyla leaned against him, her breathing shallow. "What did they do to you?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "They drugged me, threatened my parents, made me call you. I tried to sound distant, so you'd know something was wrong. Did you?" He kissed her forehead. "I knew." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in days, he saw a flicker of peace settle across her face. But Jonathan knew the fight wasn't over. They had to expose everything. Because what happened to Kyla wasn't just a betrayal. It was a crime, and someone would have to pay. The sun hung low over the Oregon hills, casting an amber haze across the cracked highway as Jonathan drove, one hand steady on the wheel, the other lightly resting on Kyla's leg. She sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in a wool blanket Antonio had pulled from a storage closet at Northwood. Her head rested against the window, her eyes closed, though she wasn't sleeping. The drugs still drifted in her system, muting her voice and slowing her thoughts, but her mind was waking faster than her body. Every so often, she whispered something, fragments of names, places, warnings. Jonathan listened to every word, filing it all away. They stopped only once, at a gas station just outside Portland, where Jonathan picked up food, water, and a burner phone. Kyla stayed in the car, her eyes following his every movement through the window, as if afraid he'd vanish. He moved quickly, careful not to use credit cards or anything traceable. He knew they would come looking soon. They had pulled Kyla from the world with silence and precision. There was no way they'd let her go without a fight. Back on the road, she finally spoke with more clarity. Her voice was raspy but firm. They kept showing me photos of my parents, said they were being watched, told me if I tried anything, if I made noise, I'd never see them again. Jonathan glanced at her, his jaw tightening. We'll make sure they're safe, I promise. They told me to call you, make it sound like I'd left you, that it was all a mistake. They had a script, they coached me, but I knew you'd know. I did. She looked down at her hands. They made me say things I didn't mean. I felt like I was fading, like I wasn't myself anymore. They didn't just want to keep me quiet. They wanted to erase me. Jonathan didn't answer. He couldn't. The rage that boiled in his chest was too big for words. He tightened his grip on the wheel and drove faster. By the time they reached the safe house, the sky had darkened completely. Cassandra Ford, an investigative journalist and Kyla's former colleague, greeted them at the door with a flashlight and a revolver tucked into the waistband of her jeans. The house was small, tucked behind a thicket of cedar trees, nearly invisible from the road. It had once belonged to her uncle, a Vietnam vet who lived off the grid. Now it was their sanctuary. Inside, the fireplace was already lit. Cassandra helped Kyla into a chair and placed a cup of tea in her hand before turning to Jonathan. I don't know what you've stepped into, she said, but if they went to the lengths of drugging her and locking her away, they're not going to stop just because she's out. Jonathan nodded. They won't, which is why we need to go public. Not without proof. I have some, he said, pulling a folder from his bag. Records from Malik, property transfers, staff rosters, hidden security footage. Not enough for a full prosecution, but enough to open an investigation. Cassandra flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing. This is a start, but you're going to need testimony. Photos, faces, more than documents. I have that too, Kyla said suddenly. Her voice was stronger now. They underestimated me. I played dumb, but I was watching. I memorized names, faces. One of the nurses bragged about who they worked for. There was a man, Dr. Givens. He ran the sedation unit. Told me they were working on quiet solutions for high-profile families. He said I was lucky they didn't go further. Further? Jonathan asked. Permanent sedation, comas, fake death certificates. I wasn't the first. A silence fell over the room. Cassandra looked stunned. This is bigger than a rogue facility. This is an industry. Kyla nodded slowly. Funded and protected by people who don't want inconvenient women talking, especially black women married to rich white men. Jonathan sat back, his mind racing. It made sense now. The disappearance, the staged mental health record, the silence from law enforcement. They weren't just trying to keep Kyla quiet. They were sending a message to others like her. Over the next few days, they worked in shifts. Jonathan contacted Malik regularly, feeding him updates, while Cassandra dug into the facility's history, uncovering lawsuits buried by settlements and media blackouts. Keela recovered slowly, detoxing from the chemicals that had dulled her body and mind. She started recording video statements, speaking clearly and passionately, even when her voice cracked. She described the layout of the facility, the routines, the threats, the procedures. She named names. Jonathan watched her with awe. Even after everything, her fire hadn't gone out. It had deepened, hardened. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a witness. On the 5th day, a breakthrough came. Malik sent Jonathan a file containing leaked emails between Margaret Miller and Delray, dated months before the wedding. The messages were damning. Discussions of reputation management, mentions of preemptive solutions, and, chillingly, a line from Margaret herself. Better she be erased than drag the family name through the mud. Jonathan read the line over and over, the words slicing into him with surgical precision. He had suspected, but seeing it in writing broke something in him. That night, Kyla found him sitting alone on the porch, staring out at the dark woods. "I'm sorry," he said before she could speak. "I should have known. I let her near us. I didn't protect you." She sat beside him, her hand brushing his. "You came for me. You risked everything. That's what matters now." He nodded, but the shame clung to him. He had believed he could straddle both worlds, his heritage and his love, his mother and his wife. Now he saw the cost of that delusion. "We need to take her down," he said. Kyla's eyes darkened. "Then let's do it together." The next morning, they uploaded the first part of Kyla's testimony to an encrypted platform Malik had built. Within hours, it was mirrored across dozens of social media channels and journalist networks. Cassandra coordinated with an editor from a major outlet, promising the full story in a weekend exposé. The firestorm was immediate. Reporters flooded the inboxes of Northwood and Margaret's legal team. Anonymous sources stepped forward. Former employees, patients' families, whistleblowers with nothing left to lose. The facility shut down operations within 24 hours. Margaret issued a sterile statement denying all involvement, but the leaked emails had already spread. By the end of the week, a congressional inquiry was opened. Federal investigators were dispatched to Northwood. Arrests were made. But the war wasn't over. Kyla knew the real battle would happen in the courtroom. She would need to testify. She would need to relive it all in front of cameras, judges, and strangers. She would need to stand up and look the system in the eye. She didn't flinch. Jonathan stood by her, ready to shield her from the blowback, but knowing she didn't need saving anymore. She had already saved herself. And now the world was going to hear her story. The courthouse loomed like a fortress against the gray sky, its tall stone columns casting long shadows across the square as protesters gathered outside. News vans lined the curb, their satellite dishes piercing the mist like metallic spears. Signs waved in the crowd, some with Kyla's name written in bold lettering, others simply bearing the word justice. Inside, the halls were quieter but tense, like the final pause before a storm. Kyla stood in the center of it all, composed and unswerving, wearing a tailored navy dress and a thin gold pin in the shape of a scale. Jonathan stood behind her, his hand lightly touching her back, not guiding, not holding, just there. Present. Solid. The weeks leading up to this moment had passed in a blur of interviews, subpoenas, and strategy sessions. Since their escape from Northwood and the viral wave of Kyla's public testimony, the world had spun into motion. Federal agencies had seized assets. Politicians had issued statements. And most importantly, the Department of Justice had launched an official criminal investigation into the Northwood Rehabilitative Center, its operators, and its financiers, including Margaret Miller. Though Kyla's statement had sparked the fire, it was the mounting pile of evidence, emails, security footage, and victim testimony that fanned it into an inferno. What had begun as a story of one woman's disappearance quickly unraveled into a revelation about a clandestine system of power used to silence, sedate, and vanish those deemed inconvenient by the elite. Wealthy families had paid for daughters, wives, and business partners to be treated into oblivion, locking them away in luxury prisons masked as clinics. Most were women. Many were women of color. All were erased. Kyla had become the face of the resistance. Now, as she walked into the courtroom, the weight of that mantle was not lost on her. The room itself was understated. Polished wood benches, a high ceiling with a skylight partially obscured by clouds. To one side, rows of journalists and spectators waited with notebooks and cameras. To the other, Margaret Miller sat stiffly behind her defense team, dressed in a pristine cream suit, pearls at her throat, not a hair out of place. She looked calm, even disinterested, but Kyla could see the tension in her jaw, the way her eyes narrowed when they met. Jonathan's mother didn't flinch. Neither did Kyla. The proceedings began slowly. The prosecution laid out their case, citing financial records that tied Margaret to the funding of Northwood and other facilities. Testimonies from former employees detailed the use of sedatives, threats, and fabricated psychiatric records. Photographic evidence was presented, including the footage from the wedding that had captured Delray watching Kyla. His arrest, made only a week earlier after he tried to flee the country, had already turned up more damning evidence. Emails between him and Margaret discussing the removal of Kyla as early as 2 months before the wedding. But nothing struck the courtroom deeper than Kyla's testimony. When she took the stand, the room seemed to inhale collectively. She began by recounting the early days of her relationship with Jonathan, how they had met, how she had tried to believe that love could transcend history and blood. She spoke plainly about Margaret's coldness, about the subtle warnings that had turned more direct over time. Then she detailed the honeymoon, the day she was taken, the man in the hallway with the uniform, the injection. She did not cry. She did not tremble. Her voice remained steady as she described waking up in a strange room, the ceiling unfamiliar, the IV in her arm. She recalled the daily routines, meals brought by gloved hands, sessions with a doctor who never called her by name, the nights of confusion and the days of sedatives. She told the jury about the threats, her parents photographed at their home, shown to her as warnings. The scripts she was forced to read, the fake phone call to Jonathan, her attempts to leave clues in her voice. "I remember thinking," she said at one point, "that maybe if I just complied, if I just became the person they wanted me to be, I could leave. But there is no exit from a lie. The more I obeyed, the more they erased me." Jonathan watched from the bench, his heart cracking open with every word. He had heard it all before, at night, in the cabin, in whispers. But hearing it now, in a room full of strangers and skeptics, made it real in a way it had never been. This wasn't just their private nightmare anymore. It was history being recorded. Under cross-examination, Margaret's defense attempted to paint Kyla as unstable, overly dramatic, driven by a political agenda, but Kyla remained composed. She answered calmly, factually, and when they asked whether she held a grudge against Margaret, she paused before replying. "I don't need to hold a grudge," she said. "Facts speak louder than any anger I could ever care dearly." The prosecution rested their case the following day. Margaret's team mounted a defense built on denial and disassociation. She had merely donated to the medical foundation that owned the property, they claimed. She had no operational control. Her emails were taken out of context. She was a philanthropist, not a conspirator. But the jury was not blind. The pattern was too clear. The emails too precise. The testimonies too numerous. By the end of the third week, deliberation took only 2 days. Margaret Miller was found guilty on multiple counts: conspiracy, unlawful detainment, medical malpractice by proxy, and obstruction of justice. Her sentence would be handed down in the months to follow, but her reputation, her empire, was already in ruins. The verdict echoed through every major news outlet. For days, Kyla's face was everywhere, on screens, in headlines, on the cover of magazines. She became a symbol not just of survival, but of resistance. And though she found the attention overwhelming at times, she knew it was necessary. Her story had ripped a hole in the fabric of polite society, exposing what lay beneath the silk: rot, control, fear. In the weeks after the trial, Kyla and Jonathan retreated to a quiet cottage in Vermont lent to them by a friend. They spent their days walking through the woods, reading, cooking together. Slowly, the weight of what they had endured began to lift, though never fully. Some nights, Kyla would wake with a start, her hands clenched into fists. Sometimes, Jonathan would stare too long at the fireplace, his mind drifting back to the night he found her. But they were healing. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, Jonathan stood on the porch, watching the flakes gather on the railing. Kyla joined him, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders. "You saved me," she said softly. "No," he replied. "You saved yourself. I just found the trail." She looked at him, her eyes searching, and then, without a word, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the wedding ring they had taken from her at Northwood. It was tarnished now, scratched along the edges, but still whole. "I kept it hidden," she whispered, "in the lining of my blanket. I knew one day I'd see you again." Jonathan took it, turned it in his fingers, and slipped it gently back onto her hand. "You never left me," he said. "No," she agreed, "and I never will." Behind them, the cottage glowed warm with lamplight. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the world in silence. And for the first time in what felt like years, the silence was not threatening. It was peace. The courthouse doors opened to the sharp gusts of an early spring wind, scattering a few petals from the cherry trees that lined the plaza. The morning light filtered through high glass windows as a stream of people filed inside, their steps echoing across the marble floors. This time the crowd was larger than before. More cameras, more reporters, and behind every lens, every notepad, every question shouted from behind velvet ropes hovered the same undercurrent. Would the system truly hold one of its own accountable? Kyla walked calmly, her steps measured, her expression unreadable. She had spent the past weeks preparing for this moment, not in the same courtroom where Margaret Miller had first faced judgment, but in the civil tribunal convened for damages, restitution, and, most painfully, the formal confrontation between mother and son. This trial was not just about money or consequences. It was about legacy, about names, about whether a son would publicly sever ties with the empire that had raised him and forged a blade against the woman he loved. Jonathan walked at her side, no longer with the quiet tension of a man hoping to avoid conflict, but with the full weight of a decision made. His jaw was firm, his eyes locked forward. This wasn't revenge. This was reckoning. The moment to reclaim not just his wife's stolen freedom, but his own voice, long buried beneath family expectations and conditional affection. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Unlike the previous trial, this one would not involve state prosecutors, but a civil panel and a legal team built from volunteer human rights lawyers, many of whom had been inspired by Kyla's case. Among them sat a woman named Eleanor Price, an aging but formidable attorney who had once sued a pharmaceutical giant for medical experimentation on poor communities. She would lead Kyla's legal strategy, and she did so with surgical precision. Across the aisle, Margaret Miller sat flanked by a new team of defense attorneys. Her previous lawyers had abandoned her following the criminal conviction, wary of being associated with a client now publicly reviled. She wore a somber navy suit, more muted than her usual pristine white or ivory, and her pearl necklace was gone. She looked older now, not humbled, but frayed. Her shoulders, always proudly squared, now dipped slightly, as though the air had grown heavier with the truth. The court proceedings began with formalities, introductions, statements, and procedural notes, but it didn't take long for the focus to sharpen. The panel was shown the full extent of Margaret's involvement in the creation and funding of Northwood and other similar institutions. Not just a donor or passive financier, she had taken active steps in selecting staff, approving protocols, and even designing the intake procedures used to quietly absorb individuals like Kyla without official documentation. There were emails, recordings, financial ledgers, all of it laid bare. When the evidence was presented showing that Margaret had sent private investigators to trail Kyla months before the wedding, the courtroom gasped audibly. When it was shown that she had directly instructed Delray to initiate contact under the guise of watching for signs of emotional instability, a silent rage spread across the room like a slow, steady tide. Kyla sat through it all, composed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She did not flinch when the images of her cell at Northwood were projected on the screen. She did not speak when her recorded intake file was played aloud, her name mispronounced, her mental state fabricated, her ethnicity described clinically as prone to emotional volatility. Jonathan, on the other hand, had to be steadied more than once. Every lie cut through him. Every insult toward Kyla was a fresh wound. Finally, after days of evidence, Eleanor called Kyla to the stand. The courtroom stilled. Kyla rose, her figure tall and graceful, and walked slowly to the witness box. She swore her oath, sat down, and faced the panel. "This time," she began, "I'm not here to explain what was done to me. I've already done that. The world has heard it, and they responded. But now I'm here to explain what it means." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "What happened to me is not just a crime of silence. It is a tradition. One older than I am, older than anyone in this courtroom. A tradition of quieting women who speak too loudly, especially women like me, black women, who dare to enter spaces we were never invited into. I was not punished because I was unstable. I was punished because I was visible." Her voice did not tremble. It resonated. This case is not just about one facility or one woman's hatred. It is about every unspoken rule that tells women to be small, to be grateful, to know their place. Margaret Miller wanted to teach me a lesson, and she did, but it wasn't the lesson she intended. She taught me that there is no negotiation with control, that you cannot earn respect by shrinking, that love, to be real, must be fought for. She turned slightly toward Jonathan, who met her gaze with a flicker of pain and pride. Jonathan fought for me, not as a white man rescuing a black woman, but as a husband choosing truth over comfort, choosing to see the whole of me, even when it meant tearing down the house he was born in. Margaret's expression, once stoic, now cracked slightly. Her fingers tightened around her armrest, but Kyla didn't look at her. Not yet. "I do not want pity. I do not need compensation to feel whole again. But what I demand, what I deserve, is recognition. Public, legal, irrevocable recognition of what was done. So that no woman after me will have to wonder if her silence is safer than her truth." The room was silent as she stepped down. When Eleanor called Jonathan to the stand, he walked to it like a man stepping into the light for the first time. He spoke plainly. He told the panel about his childhood, his mother's discipline, her obsession with image, her belief in calculated mercy. He admitted his blindness, his hesitation, the way he had once tried to compartmentalize Kyla's warnings as overreactions. He owned it all. "She didn't fail me," he said. "I failed her." When asked directly whether he believed his mother was capable of planning such an act, his answer was immediate. Yes. When asked if he regretted turning against his own blood, he answered, "No, because my bloodline is not my identity, and if it was, then I reject it." For the first time during the trial, Margaret visibly recoiled. After 2 more days of closing arguments, the panel withdrew to deliberate. It took them 3 hours. They ruled unanimously in favor of Kyla. Full damages, lifetime prohibition of Margaret's involvement in any medical or rehabilitative endeavor. A formal declaration that her actions constituted a violation of civil liberties and human rights. The judgment sent shockwaves through elite circles, not because of the money, but because of the precedent. For the first time, a member of one of the nation's most powerful families had been legally condemned not for embezzlement or corruption, but for racialized erasure. After the ruling, Kyla and Jonathan did not celebrate. They walked quietly from the building, past cameras and reporters, past onlookers with tearful eyes and raised fists. They returned to their rented apartment in the city and sat together on the balcony, watching the sun set behind the skyline. Margaret never apologized. She vanished from the public eye, her property seized, her social invitations rescinded. The woman who once ruled over institutions now lived in the shadow of her own disgrace. Kyla, however, did not fade. She began to speak. At universities, at conferences, at community forums, not just about herself, but about the system that had made her suffering possible. She founded a legal initiative for women wrongfully institutionalized. She wrote a memoir that became a bestseller. She refused interviews that wanted to label her a victim and instead told the world she was a witness. Jonathan left his post at the private hospital his mother once helped fund and joined a public health organization focused on underserved communities. He no longer wore his name like armor. He wore it like a responsibility to redefine it. And together they rebuilt. Not as symbols, but as people. Hurt, healing, and whole. The lake lay still beneath the early morning sky, its glassy surface broken only by the slow drift of mist rolling across the water. On the far shore, a cluster of birch trees swayed gently in the breeze, their white trunks stark against the dark green of the pines. The cottage sat nestled at the edge of a clearing, its chimney puffing thin ribbons of smoke into the cool air. Inside, the soft clink of dishes and the muted hum of a radio filled the quiet space as Kyla moved about the kitchen, her movements unhurried, deliberate, peaceful. It had been 6 months since the trial ended. 6 months since Margaret Miller was found liable by a panel of judges who had, for once, seen through the veil of power and privilege. Since then, life had shifted. Not with sudden drama, but with the slow, steady rhythm of healing. The media storm had ebbed, replaced by a quieter current of continued advocacy, long hours, and the simple, unfamiliar comfort of safety. Kyla had insisted on retreating somewhere distant for a time. Not to hide, she refused to be erased ever again, but to breathe. The cottage, a gift from a civil rights foundation in honor of her testimony, was secluded enough to offer privacy, but close enough to a small town that it didn't feel like exile. She had filled it with books, notes, and plans, and for the first time in her adult life, the future felt like something she could shape rather than merely resist. Jonathan had adjusted more slowly. Not because he doubted their decisions or regretted the road they'd chosen, But because the destruction of the myth he had been raised inside had left a lingering echo, he no longer spoke of his mother. He had changed his last name legally, dropping the weight of the Miller legacy without ceremony. In his professional life, he had become a vocal advocate for ethical medical practice, working with clinics that served the uninsured and underserved. The shift had been jarring at first, but purposeful. He never asked Kyla to slow down, never suggested they disappear into comfort. He understood now that comfort, when purchased at someone else's expense, was another kind of prison. That morning, Kyla carried 2 mugs of coffee out to the porch. Jonathan was already there, seated on the bench with his feet up on the railing, a blanket draped loosely around his shoulders. He smiled when she approached and took the mug without a word. They sat together, watching the fog lift. "I had another dream," Kyla said after a long pause. "Northwood?" She nodded, but this time it was empty. The lights were off, the halls were silent, like it had vanished. Jonathan set his mug down. "Maybe your mind's catching up to what your heart already knows." She looked at him. "Maybe." They sat in silence for a while longer. Then Kyla turned to him, her fingers reaching into the pocket of her cardigan. She pulled out a small velvet pouch and placed it in his hand. "What's this?" he asked. "Something I held on to, even when I didn't know if I'd ever get out." He opened the pouch and pulled out her wedding ring, the same one he had given her on a hillside under an oak tree, surrounded by the people who had loved them then. It was scratched now, dulled by time and wear, but still intact. "I never stopped wearing it," she said, "even when they took it from me. I hid it. Sewed it into the lining of my blanket with a piece of wire I found in the vent. Stupid, maybe, but it gave me something to fight for, something to prove I was still me." Jonathan's throat tightened. He turned the ring in his fingers, studying the familiar curve of the band, the inscription inside it, still faintly legible, "Always as we are." "I don't want to go back to how things were before," Kyla said. "Not to the world we thought we lived in. Not even to who we were before all this." He looked at her. "What do you want?" "I want a new beginning. One we choose. Together. Without lies. Without fear." Jonathan didn't speak. Instead, he took her hand gently and slid the ring back onto her finger. It fit as though it had never left. "This is yours," he said. "It always was." Kyla leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder as the last of the mist evaporated from the lake. Later that day, they walked into town together for the first time since arriving. It was a small, unassuming place with one main street, a bakery, a library, and a post office. No one stared. No one whispered. They weren't recognized. And for the first time in a long while, Kyla didn't feel the weight of eyes on her back. They stopped at the bookstore, where Kyla picked up a copy of a memoir by a woman who had once sued her employer for wrongful detainment. The clerk asked if they were new in town. Jonathan said they were just passing through. Kyla smiled, thanked her, and they stepped back into the street. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kyla sat at her desk by the window, typing. She was working on a collection of essays, part memoir, part manifesto. She didn't want to write a tell-all. She wanted to write something that would outlast the headlines. A map for others to follow. A promise that no one would be alone in the dark again. Jonathan sat nearby with a legal pad in his lap, drafting ideas for a mobile health initiative aimed at reaching women in isolated communities. He glanced up at her often, not to interrupt, but simply to watch her work, to remind himself of the miracle of her presence. At some point, the power flickered briefly, just a blink, and for a moment the cottage was bathed in the fading light of the fire. Kyla didn't flinch. Jonathan reached out, placed a hand over hers. "We should get backup power," he said softly. "We should," she agreed, but neither moved. The silence stretched comfortably between them. Before bed, Kyla stood at the mirror, brushing her hair. She caught her own reflection, paused, and looked at herself for a long time. She no longer saw the ghost of someone who had been nearly erased. She saw someone who had walked through fire and kept walking, someone who had not only survived, but changed the path behind her so others wouldn't fall into the same traps. She saw herself. In the bedroom, Jonathan had already pulled the blankets back, waiting. She climbed in beside him, resting her head on his chest. "I don't know what comes next," she murmured. "That's the point," he said. "It's ours to decide." They lay there until sleep came, not with fear or resistance, but with the quiet rhythm of peace. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and the lake shimmered beneath the moonlight. Somewhere, far beyond the hills, the world still spun with noise and chaos. But here, for now, they had carved out a piece of something untouched. Not perfect, but theirs. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new one. Make sure to check out our other videos for more powerful stories, and share this video with someone who needs to see it.